Well, good evening. Welcome to the monthly educational event at Historic Tredegar. On behalf of the Tredegar Society and the American Civil War Center, I want to thank everyone for coming. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge our generous sponsor. This speaker series is brought to you in part by a generous contribution from the law firm of Hunton & Williams. Since its founding here in 1901, Hunton & Williams has grown to more than 800 attorneys in 19 offices in North America, Europe, and Asia, and represents clients across the full spectrum of industries that make up today's global economy. In addition, every single lawyer at Hunton & Williams participated in pro bono service last year. As a firm, they contribute more than 50,000 hours annually to community service and charitable projects. That's a lot as a practicing attorney, including many hours of service to this museum. We thank them for their support of the American Civil War Center and the Tredegar Society. I also briefly want to mention the William & Mary Richmond Alumni Chapter, who has also graciously sponsored this event with us. It's a true honor to introduce our speaker this evening. Taylor Reveley received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. After law school, he clerked for Justice William Brennan on the Supreme Court of the United States. He practiced law for many years here in Richmond at the law firm of Hunton & Williams, where he served as managing partner of the firm for 9 years. He served as dean of the William & Mary School of Law for almost a decade. He was sworn in as president of the College of William & Mary in 2008. During his distinguished professional and academic career, President Reveley has actively supported numerous nonprofit boards and organizations. Some of the many boards he has served on include Princeton University, St. Christopher's School, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Richmond Symphony, and the Virginia Historical Society, just to name a few. Among his many academic accolades, President Reveley has studied and written extensively about constitutional division of war powers between the President and Congress. As many of you know, this topic is at the forefront of today's political talk show discussion and dialogue. As a William & Mary alumnus, I am grateful to President Reveley for being one of the best institutional representatives a university could ever ask for. His achievements as president of the college are too numerous to mention. Not many alumni get a chance to introduce the president of his or her university. I'm privileged to have this opportunity, especially with President Reveley. President Reveley has graciously agreed to speak tonight about William & Mary and its role in the Civil War. We are honored to have him here.
Well, thank you. I'm like Pavlov's dog. I go for the mic. Well, thank you very much for those kind words. It is absolutely wonderful to be here and to be back in my old stomping ground in Richmond. Brings back so many memories. All right, I'm going to be talking about the Civil War and William & Mary, and there is actually a reasonable amount to say. Fortunately. The savage, really savage conflict that convulsed our country from 1861 to 1865, convulsed Virginia in particular, has been named variously. In days gone by in the South, it was simply the war, or the recent unpleasantness, or the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression. In other quarters, the war of the rebellion, or the war for emancipation. Most often these days, simply the Civil War. And I think the name given the conflict has usually reflected the particular passion of the person doing the naming. But whatever the name, the conflict made quite a home for itself in the town of Williamsburg, the colonial capital, and in particular on the campus of William & Mary. Williamsburg sits on a peninsula, as you all know, that narrows just west of the town, creating a funnel if you're trying to push tens of thousands of troops up the peninsula toward Richmond. And that, of course, was precisely the intent of the Union Army, with the Confederates taking a very different view of the matter. The Battle of Williamsburg was joined a year into the war, on May the 5th, 1862, with roughly 20,000 combatants on both sides. After a bloody but largely inconclusive day of fighting, the Confederate forces withdrew further west, closer to the defenses of Richmond. Williamsburg, and especially the campus of William and Mary, became an armed camp for the remaining 3 years of the war. Except for occasional forays by Confederate troops, the town and the college were occupied by Federal forces, and the occupying troops were viewed with relentless hostility by the white, but not by the black, residents of Williamsburg. For them, white or black, the war at home was intensely personal. William and Mary itself, early in the war, had been abandoned by its faculty, staff, and students, most of whom had gone to serve in the Confederate Army. The college's glorious Sir Christopher Wren building, which came online in the late 1600s, was first a barracks for Confederate and then for Federal troops. In due course, the Wren building was torched by Union soldiers, the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, to retaliate for a Confederate raid on the town that had routed the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry and embarrassed them, as well as killing some of their comrades. And once the Federal troops regained control, they got drunk, set the Wren building on fire deliberately, and prevented the townspeople from coming with buckets of water to try to put it out. And other buildings and homes on campus were vandalized, books were burned or stolen, irreplaceable manuscripts were destroyed. It wasn't until 1893, on the 200th anniversary of William and Mary's founding, that Congress appropriated $64,000, which in 1893 was real money, to partially indemnify the college for its losses during the war and to help restore the Wren building. Strikingly, former Union generals Grant, Sherman, McClellan, and Meade supported this congressional appropriation for William and Mary. Meade said the destruction of the building at William and Mary College was one of those deplorable acts of useless destruction which occur in all wars. And it took a really eloquent appeal for indemnification from Massachusetts Senator George Hoar to move Congress to action. William and Mary's first attempt to get some payment for the destruction of the Wren building from Congress had been made in March 1867 to the House Committee on Southern Claims, and it had been rejected summarily out of hand because the college had not been an institution loyal to the Union. The passage of 26 years had obviously softened Federal hearts as well as Confederate hearts. I think today, for young people, the Civil War probably occupies a space and time located more or less in the vicinity of the civil wars among the Romans, or perhaps the War of Roses among the English, all of them great fratricidal struggles in their own right. But actually the Civil War was not that long ago, and it still has compelling lessons to teach us. Indeed, I think for some in the South who are now quite long in the tooth, the Civil War remains quite real. They heard about it from grandparents and great aunts and uncles who remembered people who had themselves been part of the war, either on the battlefield or on the home front, and for whom it truly had been simply the war, the enormity of the war. And the world in which they grew to maturity was framed in the aftermath of the war. And of course, at one end of the continuum, the war was enormous physical destruction, enormous financial ruin. And at the other end, it was emancipation, freedom, freedom for the slaves, both exceedingly real and relevant. Well, so much for a skeletal account of the Civil War and William and Mary. Now let me put a little bit of flesh on some of those skeletal bones. William and Mary was certainly no stranger to war in 1861. Its students and alumni had fought in all of America's colonial wars and national wars up until then. And during the Revolutionary War, the British finally got around to invading Virginia, and when they did, they came fairly quickly to Williamsburg, immediately seized the campus, turned it into a camp for British soldiers. Lord Cornwallis ingraciously took over the president's house, expelled the president and his family, churlishly even refused to let the family drink from the well in the president's house garden. But of course, Cornwallis and his troops soon had to move on toward Yorktown in the face of the oncoming American and French forces. We then invited the French to occupy the campus and to use it in particular as a military hospital. One of the buildings they used as a military hospital was the President's house, recently liberated from Lord Cornwallis. And one of the three ghosts that now lives in the President's house, we have three resident there, is in fact the disembodied spirit of a French soldier who died of his wounds during the siege of Yorktown in the President's house. I have yet to meet him. Somewhat disappointing. My wife insists, however, he's there because there is a closet door that opens on its own. Closet door has not opened on its own for me either. But we do have the French soldiers still there. The French, by accident, caught the President's house on fire while they were using it as a hospital. French king immediately paid for the repairs. So when you come to the William and Mary President's house, which is an absolutely marvelous 1733 house, and walk on its old wooden floors, they date from the 1780s, not the 1730s, but they still got there in time to receive the hoofprints of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and John Marshall and a host of others. Well, by the time it was all over, the Revolutionary War, the life of the college had been significantly interrupted and some of its buildings badly damaged. As the clouds of Civil War gathered in the late 1850s and early 1860s, the then president of William and Mary, an extraordinary human being named Benjamin S. Ewell, bitterly opposed secession, fought it to the end, hoped to the end that Virginia would in fact not secede, and he did his best to dampen his students' enthusiasm for secession before it actually occurred. But once Ewell's native Virginia left the Union, a Union he deeply loved, Ewell, like Robert E. Lee, was unwilling to part with his state, with his home, with his family. Benjamin Ewell, who was a graduate of West Point, joined the Confederate Army and served in it till the war's end. As I had previously noted, did almost all of the faculty, staff, and student body. But that was not true of William and Mary's most famous soldier alumnus at the time, Winfield Scott, who served in the United States Army longer than any other mortal had to that time or ever will again, and who served longer as a general officer in the United States Army. Scott was from Dinwiddie County, not all that far from here, and he was the commanding general of the federal forces when the Civil War broke out. Virginia offered him command of its forces when the war broke out, but Scott chose the Union, to defend the Union that he had been defending since the War of 1812, and indeed he devised the strategy that ultimately defeated the South, and it was William & Mary alumnus Winfield Scott who sought to recruit Robert E. Lee to command the federal forces. But I think, as the example of Ewell, Scott, Lee makes clear, and as with all civil wars, it was a time of very, very divided loyalties and often agonizing choices that the people of that era had to make. Well, back to William & Mary itself, its campus during the Civil War, especially its iconic East grounds, the part of the campus that now literally abuts the living reincarnation of the 18th century, colonial Williamsburg. The East Campus includes our three oldest buildings, which are the three oldest academic buildings in the United States. We have not one of those, not two, we have three. Harvard has none. But of course, unpleasant of me to mention that. The three iconic buildings, the Sir Christopher Wren Building, which came online in the late 1600s, the Brafferton, where I now have my office and the provost does, which came online in 1723, and the President's House, 1733. All three had been damaged, in some cases really hideously, as with the Wren, burned by the Pennsylvania cavalry. Damage was devastating. Students, faculty, staff dispersed, books up in flame. Endowment largely gone. We're very concerned about asset classes these days and whether they are good investments or not. Confederate bonds proved to be a remarkably bad asset class. You put your money in Confederate bonds, gone. Things were extraordinarily bad for William & Mary. But under the indomitable leadership of Benjamin Ewell, President Ewell, who had stayed, in effect, while in the Confederate Army, president of William & Mary, under his leadership, his courageous leadership, William & Mary struggled to reopen after the Civil War. Classes finally resumed in 1869, but had to be suspended again in 1881 because this school simply ran out of money. And during this sad time, when the college had resumed operation and then suspended operation, President Ewell once a year would climb up into the Wren Building, go to its bell, and ring the bell to remind those who heard and those who kept the faith that the college did still live and that it would rise again. Well, William & Mary did rise again, and so did Williamsburg. And William & Mary stayed in Williamsburg once it rose again, though there was a heavy push to move William & Mary to Richmond or to Norfolk, on the assumption that Williamsburg, the former colonial capital, had its moment in the sun, that Williamsburg was irreparably down the drain, and that William & Mary really ought to go somewhere that was not down the drain. but William and Mary stayed in Williamsburg. And William and Mary refused to die because many people in the North, as well as the South, refused to let William and Mary die. They refused to see the alma mater of the nation simply cease to exist. The alma mater of the nation that educated United States Presidents Jefferson, Monroe, and Tyler, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall, and legions of other leaders of Virginia and the United States during the Revolutionary and early national era. People simply refused to let William and Mary die. No other college or university in the United States has been caught directly in the path of two wars. Some have been caught in the path of one war. No other school has been caught in the path of two wars. William and Mary was, and William and Mary suffered extensive damage in each, including having many of its buildings burned. There is only one city in the United States that has been burned in two wars, and that's Richmond. Some wars, Revolutionary and Civil War. And of course, Richmond, like William and Mary, is very much alive and well at the moment. Like the Phoenix, both the college and the city rose from the ashes. Now, in part, the college survived by taking a drastic act. In 1906, when its finances were still very fragile, barely had a nostril above the waves, actually didn't have a nostril above the waves consistently, the college appealed to the state for support. And then in 1906, in return for some operating support from the taxpayers of Virginia, William and Mary deeded its property, its real estate, its personal property, lock, stock, and barrel to the Commonwealth of Virginia. So in 1906, William and Mary ceased being a private university and became part of Virginia's state system. In return, there was meaningful state support, and also a growing morass of state rules and regulations, and constant exposure to the whims of the political process. Very much a mixed blessing. And the Commonwealth, upon putting William and Mary on its payroll, insisted that in addition to being a college focused on the liberal arts, it also become a state normal school, a school to train teachers for the K-11, as it was then, public school system of Virginia. So for a couple of generations, William and Mary did that quite brilliantly. And that was a wonderful service to the public schools. It did great good for the Commonwealth in that respect. But one of the salient characteristics of people who go into K-12 education is, while they are the salt of the earth, doing magnificent work and earning a privileged place in heaven, they do not have two nickels to rub together. So philanthropically speaking, that was not a plus for the alma mater of the nation. In 1918, to further buttress its financial position, the college became the first single-sex school in Virginia, male or female, to admit the other sex. William and Mary, which had been a private, all-male school for so long, and then a state all-male school, admitted its first women in 1918, and they, of course, have contributed enormously to the life and academic caliber of the school. But for a long time, that was not a philanthropic plus either. Things have changed now. Women are a powerful philanthropic force in this country now. It used to be if the guy had gone to Hampden-Sydney or Washington and Lee or the University of Virginia, and his wife had gone to William and Mary, guess who got the money? That's changed. Well, while William and Mary was going through all of this, to some extent suffering the tortures of the damned, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were motoring on at flank speed, enjoying the fruits of victory in the Civil War. In my view, but for the Civil War, there is a very strong likelihood that William and Mary, when the Ivy League was formed, the private Ivy League was formed, would have been the southernmost school in it. It's no further from Princeton to William and Mary than it is from Princeton to Dartmouth, and it is a lot warmer than William and Mary. And I think in every other respect, William and Mary really is the paradigm of what are now called public Ivy. History, deep roots in American history, great contributions to American history, an exquisite human-scale campus, a relatively small student body, academic excellence, extraordinary faculty, staff, students. But for the Civil War, and I think there's a lesson to be learned here. If you're an institution of higher education, it never pays to be on the wrong and on the losing side of a civil war that is fought in part on your campus. Just don't do it. And William and Mary was on the wrong, not just the losing side of the Civil War. And I think but for slavery, while there would have been severe sectional rivalries and disputes and growing pains between the North and the South, there would not have been a war. It took a ghastly war to end slavery. For a lack of political vision, political will to end it otherwise, even though we had the example of the British, who borrowed a huge amount of money, the government, to end slavery by essentially buying the enslaved people's freedom in England and in the Caribbean. It's taken William and Mary a very, very long time to come to grips with its racial past. The college owned slaves before the Civil War, and it was segregated for a long time after the Civil War. And the only role that African Americans had on campus after the war was a very menial role. They would come early in the morning, they would work very hard all day, and then they would leave. Our first black student was a part-time master's candidate in education, started in the summer of 1951. Our first black graduate was a law student who graduated in 1954. The first African American undergraduates to live on campus and graduate were 3 women who arrived in 1967 and graduated in 1971, and only recently have come back into close communion with the college. Our first black student was elected to Phi Beta Kappa in 1978. He was Brian Blunt, who is now the president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond. Our first black rector of our Board of Visitors As you all know, that's Virginia speak for Board of Trustees. Michael Powell was rector for 2 years and left the board in 2009. And William & Mary is now into its third year of a very extensive process of research and reflection into all aspects of our racial past, starting with slavery. The goal being an absolutely unvarnished understanding of what happened, how it evolved, where it went. And we're making significant progress on that front. But I think a second lesson of the Civil War for William and Mary is that it really does take a very long time to respond fairly and responsibly to the consequences of an extremely bitter and devastating defeat. And I should say, juxtaposed to William and Mary's largely grim past of slavery and segregation, William and Mary was also the very first institution of higher education in America to create a school on campus for black children, slaves as well as free black children. That school got underway in 1760. And the founder of William and Mary's Law School, the great George Wythe, Law School was founded in 1779, was an adamant, eloquent, articulate opponent of slavery who taught his students for years that it was incompatible with the American commitment to liberty. And Wythe's successor as leader of William and Mary's Law School, St. George Tucker, was himself keenly aware of the evils of slavery and sought a practical way of ending it. And I think perhaps a third lesson of the Civil War is the difficulty, and this isn't just for William and Mary, is the difficulty of reaching a balanced view of such a catastrophic struggle. For a long time, particularly in the South, at one end of the continuum, there was a serious emphasis on a grossly romantic view of the Old South, awash in white columned mansions, with allegedly happy slaves, an aristocratic code of honor, historic agrarian virtues, courageous resistance during the Civil War in the teeth of overwhelming men and material from the North, ultimate defeat despite brilliant generals and heroic soldiers. One end of the continuum. Now I think we've almost gone to another end of the continuum, where everything about the Civil War is now viewed through the lens of slavery as an explanation of both why people in the South and North fought, with the abolition of slavery perhaps as the mediating grace for the awful carnage of the conflict. But it seems to me this too oversimplifies more complex reality. I think many people in the North initially, not at the end, but initially, went to war to preserve the Union as their primal objective. And even late in the war, that was an important federal goal. And it seems to me in the South, in a way often hard to understand these days, people's loyalty to their home, to their family, to their state was powerful. So for some people in the South, like President Ewell of William and Mary, this loyalty, and Robert E. Lee, proved more powerful than their strong devotion to the Union. And of course, I think people have always resisted invading forces because they fear the invader. They fear for their homes and families. Well, enough about the Civil War and William and Mary, and the Civil War's aftermath at William and Mary. William and Mary, I can't leave without a commercial for William and Mary. I would actually not be able to go back to Williamsburg. Now, William & Mary is absolutely thriving these days. As a university of 5 schools that insists on calling itself a college, arts and sciences, law, business, education, marine science. William & Mary in the last generation has become a serious research university, but it has done it without throwing its undergraduate program under the wheels. Tenured faculty, research active faculty at William & Mary in arts and sciences teach undergraduates. They know them by name, they teach them in class and out. That is extraordinarily rare for a research university. And as was true during the Revolutionary and early national era, William & Mary continues to train leaders for all walks of life in all parts of the country. And at the federal level, since the turn of this century, turn of the 21st century, William & Mary alumni have produced a Secretary of Defense who served 2 presidents of very different political parties. That's never happened before, a death-defying feat. We have had the chair of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, an alumna from California. We now had the director of the FBI among our alumni. We had the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, an alumna, director of national parks, and the chief scientist of NASA. And of course, William & Mary alumnus Jon Stewart has created an entire new genre of what might loosely be called news. And our alumnus Mike Tomlin was the youngest coach and the first African American to win a Super Bowl, Pittsburgh Steelers. And last thought, by way of commercial, William & Mary has had an absolutely bonzo run of chancellors during the last generation. Now, our chancellors are in the British tradition. That means it's an honorary post, honorary head of the institution. So they show up for ceremonial occasions, and they wear the most richly elegant robes. They have chains that hang around their neck, lovely chains. They offer a few inspirational words. They wave. They occasionally give sage advice to the president. But otherwise, like the Queen, they reign but do not rule. And they serve for 7-year terms. Now, our first American chancellor after the Revolutionary War was George Washington, and he served for 11 years. And indeed, when the history police aren't around, I claim George Washington as one of William & Mary's presidents, because if you got Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, nobody comes close. He was our first American chancellor. He got the only thing he ever got from any school by way of a certificate from William & Mary. It was a surveyor's license. Admittedly, he got it in the mail. And uncharacteristically, he never paid for it. But he didn't get anything from anybody else. But Washington was our first American chancellor. They had all been English before that. And in recent years, we've had the following run of chancellors. Warren Burger, who had been Chief Justice of the United States, was followed by Margaret Thatcher, who had been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Then came Henry Kissinger, U.S. Secretary of State. Then we had Sandra Day O'Connor, first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. And now we have Bob Gates, William & Mary class of 1965, Secretary of Defense, former head of the CIA. That's a great run. And they all have pulled their oars. Well, Henry Kissinger, a little bit less. He only lasted 4 years. But the rest of them have been absolutely magnificent. Margaret Thatcher was amazing. Sandra Day O'Connor, enormously powerful, been on the court, but completely down to earth, utterly delightful to be with. She would tell you just what she was willing to do, what she didn't want to do. And she loved the kids and dealt with them quite wonderfully. And Bob Gates is now just a great source of strength and help for the college. So our institution of the chancellor in the British tradition has stood us in enormously good stead. Well, you all have been very good to sit there quietly and listen to me talk about William and Mary during the Civil War, and then deliver a reasonably brief commercial for the alma mater of the nation. It's been good to be with you.